So today we're going to talk about collaboration, right? Between John and Paul
Yeah,
and just collaboration in general.
yeah, exactly.
So I know we always want to start these episodes with what would be like the title? What would be the title? And I'll just throw out a couple at you. Obviously, We Can Work It Out is a good one. And Two of Us is a good one. Uh
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I think those are great choices, and just the names of those capture a lot. And then it's interesting when you kind of look into the songs. Two of Us, Paul swears, was written just about Linda in their early days, but I've heard quite a few fans talk about how there seems to be some messages about John in there too. So yeah, I like that. And then We Can Work It Out, of course, is it's a good sentiment, but of course in the song he's like, try to see it my way, and then we can work it out. Which is probably normal for Paul and his mode of operation. But yeah, I don't know if I could top those. I thought of a few others. Let's see. Do you know that tune from Flaming Pie, the song we were singing?
I've probably heard it, but no. And this is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I've been thinking of you because I've been listening to the Paul McCartney singles collection chronologically.
Hmm.
So at some point that may come up today. If not, we'll hit it at another time. But no, I don't really know that song. And also, anything that we can find that's Beatles, not that we reject anything that's Paul solo or John solo, but anything we can, find that the two of them wrote together, I think captures more gravitas and more strength. But what else you got?
Yeah, I hear you. We'd have to put our heads together on more Beatles stuff. But well, I did think of All Together Now, it as at least in the title, I like it. And on the Paul side, maybe Let Me Roll It, let me roll it to you, yeah, as he says, and it's kind of a back and forth of collaboration. And then You Gave Me the Answer, that's you know that one.
I do. I love Venus and Mars. Well, so first of all, Let Me Roll. It's interesting because I think I've mentioned this to you. That song to me, from what I've read, is a bit of a shot at John and his primal scream and all that stuff. And You Gave Me the Answer is a great song. I think We Can Work It Out and Two of Us, despite what you just told me about Linda, because I didn't know that, those songs to me are not about romantic love as much. I mean, We Can Work It Out certainly can be construed as that. The other thing that's interesting about We Can Work It Out is I wonder, and I'm going to say no, but I could be wrong. I wonder when Paul was writing that song, and that was sort of back in the day when they were writing songs together, if that was sort of a cry to John in terms of their relationship. My experience with early Beatles, pre-Rubber Soul Beatles, is very rarely were they writing for meaning, and they were writing more, I think, just for this is a good song. You can disagree with that. I could be wrong, but I feel like their songwriting got much more introspective and autobiographical right about the time right after We Can Work It Out, when they were doing Rubber Soul, although that's probably a very similar time frame.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with the song Help is kind of the start of a new sort of writing for John. Yeah, I think I believe Paul wrote We Can Work It Out after an argument with Jane Asher back in the day. But yeah, I see a lot of this stuff, it could be subliminal and certainly he and John had a very strong relationship. And this is one of the things we'll be touching on as we go on here today. But like, I was thinking about, I'm so glad we got the Get Back, the 8-hour Peter Jackson documentary, because I knew they liked each other, and obviously they were good for each other musically, but you could really see in that documentary the love that they had for each other, and and the respect that they have for each other musically. So,
but also, and I think this is where our collaboration comes into it. And, this is at the very core of what we're talking about. I think you can also see the creative tension very much in the forefront of that documentary. The dismissiveness of John, the indifference of John, the insistence of Paul. And I do want to say this just because we're setting the stage for this conversation, and I'm not trying to exaggerate my importance here, but I too witnessed how to collaborate with Paul McCartney when we did the Super Bowl. So I would like to touch on that a little bit today as it impacts the conversation. But I think you bringing up Get Back is really a good place to start, because I think it shows the magic and the effectiveness of their collaboration, but at the same time, in a way, the beginning of the dissolution of their collaboration. And of course, they went on to do Abbey Road after those sessions. But to me, even Wings, because I've been listening to the Paul McCartney singles thing. Wings to me was more collaborative than post Wings. So Paul went from sort of, John and Paul to Paul and sort of not a democracy, but Linda and Denny Lane seem to have a lot of input. And then now Paul is really not a collaborator. I mean, he, other than doing some things with Elvis Costello and the unfortunate Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson collaborations. And, and that's, even if we're going to be really like rabbit hole, that's why I think the Fireman album is interesting, because that's a collaboration. So, and then even as you and I have prepared to do these episodes, our sort of attempt at collaborating with each other and appreciating the differences, and then at the same time getting frustrated with the differences. We have very, very different opinions of, let's just for fun, our poster child, McCartney 3. And so, when you collaborate with someone, and this is the interesting tension of that band, how much do you let the other person's positives enter into your expression, and how much of that forms a block? And of course, the more you're collaborating for something in the public eye, and I can't think of anything more public than the Beatles music, the more tension. I'll even give you some Super Bowl stuff. Like, McCartney was a CEO. He collaborated with no one. But the next year I did the Rolling Stones, and there was this weird Mick Jagger, Keith Richards thing. And then I would do like Prince, and then I would do like The Who with Townsend and Daltrey. So the collaboration, in a way, I mean, this is not a series about The Who, but the Townsend Daltrey collaboration is a very fascinating collaboration. And there's the U2s and the Radioheads and the Eagles and so many of these bands. And I think that, the tragic thing, or the sad thing about the Beatles, and we've talked about this, is so much of life is represented in not just the Beatles music, but the way they related to each other. And it's a beautiful collaboration, and in a lot of ways it's a sad collaboration. And in listening to this McCartney compilation, which is fresh in my mind, I think the farther away, now part of this might be just age and whatever, but the farther away the Beatles got from the Beatles, the more their music was, I'm going to just, for lack of a more eloquent way to say it, not as good. I mean, by the time you get into the later 70s, I'm going to argue that none of them were making the music that they were making in the early 70s or the 60s. And I guess the interesting thing about collaboration is, for those that can do it, in a lot of ways, it's a blessing, I think, because I would argue it probably helps you sustain creativity longer, because there's almost safety in numbers, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a lot in what you said there. I I think there's probably no right way to do collaboration per se. And this is one of the things we can get into it. If we look at John and Paul as, just kind of a window into the subject, I think they're both interesting test cases because, yeah, of course they collaborated with each other, and at least artistically, I think you and I would agree that that was their central lifetime collaboration, and they worked very well together for the most part. And there was a lot of give and take there, and a lot of deference to each other when when it was called for. Then and that's one way to do collaboration, and we'll talk about that when we even go back to the beginnings of their relationship and how John, quote unquote, chose Paul as his partner. But then once they went through the Beatle maelstrom, I think they didn't want that kind of collaborator anymore. Now, John with Yoko is an interesting test case because I think he tried it for a few years to have it be co-equal, more or less. And, I think that culminated in sometime in New York City. I don't know if you ever listened to that disaster, but I think he sort of said enough of that after that album until they got the Double Fantasy. And then Paul, he started off just kind of working with himself, and then he quickly grew tired of that and said, "Oh, Linda, I want you to help me." But that was never an equal relationship, and she knew that, and he knew that, and they were fine with that. And then Denny Lane's a very laid back guy, and that wasn't equal either. But he produced some good stuff in the 70s, and of course George worked pretty much with himself. If we want to expand the Beatle circle, he collaborated a little bit with Phil Spector on that first album. But I think I guess what I'm saying is I'll put it as a question. I wonder if the only mistake you could make in collaboration, or let's say the biggest mistake you could make, is not knowing what you're looking for in a partner. So for example, if you really wanted to carry your vision, a singular vision, that would probably be a mistake, or could be, to get somebody of equal weight that wants to put in a lot of their input. Maybe it's better to just have a more of a supportive partner. And then there's times I don't know, you're in the mood, or you don't quite have that singular vision, and you think, no, let me work with a team that's going to be co-equals. I think as long as you know what you want, you're probably going in the right direction, and then it's a matter of finding the right people depending on what you want.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was thinking about different things. So I want to talk about respect, and I want to talk about friendship, but the collaboration thing is interesting because George Martin was also a huge part of that collaboration, and he wasn't always involved after that, and was a loss. So in a way, we're also talking about chemistry and luck and timing. I think for the Beatles and for John and Paul, there was no doubt when you watch Get Back, I'm not suggesting that John didn't respect Paul, because he did. There's no question he did. But you can tell in that documentary that Paul wants John's approval constantly in that documentary. And I think a lot of what Paul didn't realize, because he had come of age with John, is that he was able to stand on his own 2 feet, but he didn't want to. Whereas John sort of needed Paul to be his better creative self, but he was determined not to need and not to want Paul anymore. And I also think that what happened with these guys, and we can talk about collaboration, you and I are friends, right? We are friends.
Yeah.
But I've been forced to collaborate in my career many, many times with people who are not my friends, and people who I don't even necessarily at times like. So collaboration is an interesting concept, because when you say, what you want, I don't disagree, but that's pretty much coming from an artist entrepreneurial choice, when you have free will of who you want to collaborate with. In this particular case, I think, and we'll probably say this a lot, they were probably a victim of not just their own success, but their intimacy as friends. Because I think what's been sort of, and Brian Epstein is also a big part of this collaboration, I think what's been sort of, excuse me, discussed is that at some point they, and Lennon more than McCartney said this, they wanted to grow up. I remember Lennon saying something of, there comes a time where you don't want to just hang around with the boys on a Saturday night. And, that's also just stages of life, that the ages that they were. It would be interesting, and we'll never know, if they could come back. Like I just saw an Instagram post from Pink Floyd where it's David Gilmour and Nick Mason wishing you a happy new year. Well, Rick Wright has passed on, and Roger Waters clearly is not going to sit in that photo. And yet, for my money, Pink Floyd has never been Pink Floyd again, no matter what they call themselves, since Roger Waters was no longer in Pink Floyd. And Roger Waters has never been. So with the Beatles, I think, and this is why this is such a fascinating series for us, in their collaboration, you see so much kind of good and bad. And even when they weren't as joined at the hip as they were in the early days, it still, I think, was a real force when they were, at least they had to sit in the same room together and put something out as one.
Look, I think it's pretty much universally good. All, the vibrations weren't always good, and it, it was fraught in many ways at times, but the results were pretty much good all the way across the board. So let's take a moment and go back to the beginning of their relationship. So as I understand it, they met, I think, in 1957, and I guess they had seen each other around town a little bit before the party that John was playing at, and they meet backstage, so to speak, at the end of that party. And Paul played 20 Flight Rock famously, and he knew all the words, and that was very impressive to John. And a few days later, he invited him to be in the band. And John is on the record as saying that he thought about the kind of Buddy Holly approach, which was very popular at the time, of, you have a front man who's in the spotlight, and maybe a backing group, but it's really about the one guy, Rory and the Hurricanes, and many others. And I think he was on that track probably until he met Paul. And at that time, they're just young kids. It's like, of course, how much prescience we can, retrospect back there. We're just speculating. But when he talked about it later, he said, "I chose Paul to be my partner." I'm paraphrasing, but I didn't have to do that. But I felt that was going to make the whole output better, even if it would detract from me somewhat. So I think that was a really bold move on John's part. And listen, the rest of us are not John Lennon, and in some ways we're probably happy about that, and in some ways we wish we could be. But my point is, he probably didn't absolutely need a collaborator. I think he obviously, he was an incredible artistic force and a force of nature. And if he wanted to make it work, I think he could have. So for a guy like that to some extent turn the reins over to another clearly equal talent is interesting, and at the least, and impressive at the most.
Well, first of all, back to the artists, I think Elvis and Chuck Berry were probably the two maybe most influential artists for John. But I think it goes back to something that you said. You have to know what you want. And I think when the period of time that you described, what John wanted was to be in a band, because John loved the music. John probably subliminally and subconsciously wanted a family because he didn't really have one. And when he heard Paul sing, he probably, as a music aficionado and raw ambition, said, oh my God, this guy's phenomenal. I want him on my team. Their collaboration, I think, started to suffer. And I don't mean suffer in terms of the output. I mean suffer in terms of the acrimony. When I think John didn't want to be in a band anymore, and Paul still did. And that's when I think things started to pull apart, and Epstein died, and drugs came into the equation, and money and fame came into the equation, and all the things that pull you apart, which again is why I think the Beatles are such an interesting, even when I think of the Murdoch family, they're collaborative, but at the same time they pull each other apart. So I think you sort of hit the nail on the head with the what you want, because most of the bands that have been successful, you could add U2 to that list, you could add Queen to that list, you could even add the Kinks and Oasis to that list as brothers. They knew what they wanted. They wanted to be famous rock and roll stars, right? Simon and Garfunkel. But maybe this is kind of morphing too into a question of collaboration and how do you sustain it over time? Because you also talked about various degrees of democracy. I mean, Charlie Watts was the drummer of the Rolling Stone. Ringo Starr was the drummer of the Beatles. They were collaborators, but they were not sort of the decision makers. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that John and Paul not only were alpha male strong personalities, but they had the best voices and they were extremely talented. And the marriage of their voices was something that one could argue will never be equaled in rock and roll. I mean, George obviously too is a very good singer. The 3-part harmonies like Yes It Is and Because, but that's why I love, and maybe we when we end we have to choose, that's why I love Two of Us, because the Beatles at their strongest were, not that they weren't strong when this wasn't the case, but the Beatles at their best were John and Paul singing together and writing together, and it just unfortunately wasn't sustainable. And I just want to make one other point, and I know I'm talking for a long time, but let me just make this other point. It's interesting too, because you could talk about marriage being a collaboration. Paul with another Paul or John with another John probably would have been a disaster.
Well, yeah, so that's another, just at the end there, that's an interesting point you make about, okay, at times you want another heavyweight, you want someone who's going to challenge you, who's going to bring fresh ideas. But if they're too similar to you in disposition and worldview, then there might be some magic missing. So, luckily in the case of John and Paul, they really had it all in the sense of mutual talent, although they brought, different emphases of talent to the party, but they were both very talented, but they weren't the same. They saw the world from a kind of a different lens, and just their personalities were clearly very different. So, and probably you hear that opposites attract in romantic relationships. And I certainly wouldn't want to be with a clone of myself, maybe for a day that would be interesting, but for the most part, I want a partner who's, somewhat different than me, and my partner's very different from me in many ways, and I get a lot out of that, So yeah, that's an interesting point.
And they
Let's
also they also had a bond. They had the bond of losing their moms at an early age, and the music and post-war Britain. But what I think too is interesting is I think the key to a successful collaboration is listening to the other person. And I can't help but drift into stories when you speak that make me think about advancing the conversation. When we worked with McCartney on the Super Bowl, it was the first one that we were involved with, so we learned as we went. But that show was all him. He had hired a guy named Roy Bennett to do the stage. He was very, very, I don't want to say dictatorial, because that's a negative connotation. He knew exactly what he wanted. Now, one stroke of collaboration, which was fascinating, is that the producer of that show was a guy named Don Mischer. And Don was a legendary producer director. And he ended up doing a bunch of these shows. And he had done, I believe, the Diana Ross show, maybe even the Michael Jackson show. And we flew to London and we had a meeting with Paul. And Paul went through the whole show for us. And if you remember, the set list of that show was Drive My Car, Get Back, Live and Let Die, and Hey Jude. And Paul had long before picked out the songs and everything. And Don in that meeting suggested to Paul, can you flip Live or Let Die? Can you flip Live and Let Die and Hey Jude? So we end with Hey Jude, which was a brilliant suggestion. And Paul took that suggestion. That was a small degree of collaboration. But at that point of his career, it was 40 years past, John. So, or yeah, 34 years past John, whatever it was. So again, levels of collaboration and willingness to listen.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting part of.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think he always enjoy. I'm speaking of Paul. I think he always enjoys a degree of collaboration all throughout his life. It's just a matter of how much he's willing to let the other person contribute, so to speak. But it's also interesting when you just mentioned that one little comment, and you think about, I guess John and Paul started writing Face to Face and all of that, and as I understand it, most of those tunes, like 100+ tunes, they never even recorded. There was just this kind of practice, really. That's not to say they never wrote Face to Face again, but I think it was relatively rare. But it could often be one or two little comments that would either get you started on a song idea or stop you from a blind alley that's not going to work. And I think they each had uncanny ability to just make those suggestions in a positive way, I guess, where the other person could accept it. And yeah, they both were very respectful of each other's input. I don't think they always took whatever the other person said, but I think for the most part, if one guy was like, that's not going to work, or really this is going to work, they'd probably would listen to it.
Well, yeah, and I think it's that moment in Get Back where he's trying on different Arizonas, and he says Tucson, Arizona, and John's like, yeah. And of course, A Day in the Life is the poster child for sort of the collaboration. But what happens, I think, with collaboration is, can you accept what the other person is beyond the area of you're working with? And I'll give you an example that hopefully is waning in our country, which is, could I collaborate with the trumper? You know what I mean? Like, if I was making music with somebody and then I found out that they were a trumper, and to define trumper, a Donald Trump fan, I don't know whether I could. I have to say, I don't know whether I could continue. Now, that's just me. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think they were in such lockstep for so long about everything. And it's, to me, without question, what would be, I've thought about this every time I watch Get Back, would be the conversation that Paul would have with Linda that night and John would have with Yoko that night. And one would imagine it would be each of them complaining to their wives about the other guy, because you don't really see any of that in Get Back, but you sense it. You sense the frustration. And I have to think that a lot of that frustration had nothing to do with music. It had to do with Alan Klein, or, you know, the sort of, or drugs, or whatever. They were starting to live their lives as different people. And to go back to your original point, they wanted different things. And I feel like that sort of, maybe it didn't affect their musical collaboration at the time, but it ended their musical collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think John, in his mind, he wanted Yoko to be his new partner. Again, it's like, I think maybe we stand back now and we find that hard to believe, but from everything I've read and from his own mouth, that was how he saw it. Like, he wasn't just not wanting a partner, he just wanted a new partner.
I agree, but my question to you is, again, when we're talking about collaboration and we're specifically talking about John and Paul, where does the work end and everything else begin? So I think the point you're trying to make is John wanted a partnership with Yoko unilaterally about everything.
Yeah.
From what they were doing that day to, because look, we all have friends who, you know, they have wives or whatever. And it's like, well, all of a sudden, like, that collaboration, that's the thing about those guys. The collaboration, the two of us, the We Can Work It Out, was originally sort of everything was one. And then as they grew up and they became more successful, then, you know, where was the line of demarcation between music and everything else? And that affected their collaboration.
Yeah, I think the wives came into the picture, and they weren't just sort of in the background kind of wives. And you know, Linda was probably on the quiet side comparatively, but nevertheless, she wasn't just kind of a background person. I think she was very much a force in Paul's life. And so, yeah, they just had these two new partners that they were excited. And then, you know, kids come into it, and it's family and all of that. So that's part of just growing up. And then, as far as, I think there were starting to be some musical differences, you know, like John started to get kind of tired of Paul's, what he called his granny music, his honey pies.
You gave me the answer.
Yeah,
I love that song, but you gave me the answer.
You know, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was the one that, you know, was driving everybody crazy. And then I think Paul, as much as he was actually into avant-garde music, you know, before John apparently, and quite liked it, but I think he, from what I understand, he wasn't thrilled with putting Revolution #9 on the White Album, you know, especially at that length. And he and the other Beatles apparently just flat out said, no, we're not doing Cold Turkey as the Beatles. We're not interested in that song. So I think that there started to be some musical differences too. But, you know, I think as we're talking about this, I think a lot of it was just, they were growing up, and they were maturing into sort of, you know, who they wanted to be, and they didn't want to compromise as much anymore, which I think is, you know, very common.
And the other part of this is, we as human beings, particularly when we're in it now, in the case of John and Paul, we're studying it. Scholars have studied it. You know, it's been scrutinized and scrutinized and scrutinized. But I think there's a tendency, and this is the death of collaboration. And I've even noticed that I have to be careful, even with you, with this, When you start to get into what's right and what's wrong, then you're really, really in trouble. And as we look back on their relationship, I don't think it's fair to say either one was right or wrong. But I think there's a tendency, again, both when you're in it and when you're observing it, I'm right, he's wrong, that guy, Paul's right, John's wrong. And, that's a recipe for creative divorce or
Oh, yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Because I do think the other part of the music thing was, I just think it's human nature. You can feel free to disagree with me. I do think there had to be, in the back of their minds, a little bit of ego of, do I need this guy? Can I do this by myself? Like now I don't think Paul felt that way at the time, but I think John did, to some degree. And also, I think, to your point too about I think John puts Revolution 9 on the Beatles because he wants people to get pissed off. And Paul puts Honey Pie on the Beatles because he wants to be, nostalgic and vaudevillian, and that was a callback to his roots. I love both songs for very different reasons. And but the magic of those guys, I mean, maybe there's one song they ever put out, maybe not even, that I don't like. Whereas when they were not together, and a lot of, like, I often wonder if some of these songs were on Beatles records, does it change the entire perception of the song?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Even if it's the same song.
I've thought, particularly with regard to Something and Here Comes the Sun, as much as George was ready to move on in many ways, I personally believe he, to some extent, was very strategic about that. And he knew, A, the Beatles would do the best version of these songs, and B, it would get the most exposure. And I mean, imagine, just for hit's sake, I mean, those on his solo album would have been, incredible. But yeah, I think he was right on that. I mean, he worked with some great players, but you're just not going to get that bass line in Something from anybody else other than Paul McCartney.
Well, the George thing, I think, is a different series. Maybe that's our next series, because I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I want to stay on topic. I think what I'm suggesting, though, is look at it this way. If I'm just trying to pick out the right song, and you'd probably be much better than I would, but if you take a song like Big Barn Bed off Red Rose Speedway, and I love that song, but you put it on Abbey Road, or you put it on, Let It Be or whatever, because they were right. Some of these songs, we now realize, it seemed like at the time, oh, Red Rose Speedway was a million years after.
Right.
But it wasn't.
Yeah.
So, and we even know from watching the Get Back documentary that there were a lot of songs that ended up being solo songs. So, like Ballad of John and Yoko could have ended up being a solo song. The magic of that song, it really literally is one of the best collaborations of the two of them, because it's only the two of them, and the harmonies are amazing on that song.
Right.
But, it's just funny when you look at some of the early 70s John and Paul solo stuff, and you're like, yeah, good song. But if it's right smack in the middle of Abbey Road, is it, oh no, that's in the pantheon.
I think there's a handful that are perfect the way they are. Something like Maybe I'm Amazed. I don't want it any other way. I don't want John's voice on there. I don't want.
But do you want it? I don't disagree. My question, though, is, do you want it on a Beatles record? And does it take a different? Is it looked at differently? If Maybe I'm Amazed is.
I think that's indisputable. It's going to be looked at differently, and it'll have a different reception. But I guess I'm thinking of it from the standpoint of the collaboration. So that's one of them. I won't go through all of them, but let's see. On John's side, something like Imagine, I think, is perfect the way it is. But you mentioned Big Barn Bed, which is that's a rather slight Paul song, all things considered. But in a perfect world, I think John would have helped with those lyrics and made them a little bit more clever. I think he and George's harmonies would be better than Denny Lane and Linda, although they're very nice. And I think the arrangements they would have come up with would have been, I would, if I had to bet, I would say it would sound better on with the four Beatles.
But the other thing about collaboration as it relates to John and Paul in the later Beatles days is, for the first time, Eric Clapton was playing on a track, which was George. Billy Preston was playing on a track, which I think everybody will agree lit Let It Be Up.
Oh, yeah.
Like before he showed up, it was, and Paul was really chafing about the collaboration with Phil Spector. So, there started to be a collaboration. And this is another interesting thing about collaboration. So you and I are doing this series on the Tao of John and Paul, right? And what about, like, when we're planning to do like 8 episodes? What about if episode 7 we start bringing in your son or my son, and we start looking to that? And it's not the same. It's not the same collaboration anymore, because all of a sudden now you're getting other inputs and you're maybe worrying a little bit too much about what other people think. And I think the saddest thing to me about the Beatles, but beyond the tragedy of the assassination in 1980, is that, and I think we've talked about this many times. I mean, my parents got divorced. You fall in love with these individuals and you want them to be together. And it breaks your heart when they're not. And in this case, I think what we're trying to do is unpack the reasons why it is very difficult for people to stay together. And again, I think in the case of these two guys, maybe it's the only way you can do it, but there was both a professional and a personal intimacy.
Right. And that's almost impossible to separate completely for anybody. And I just want to throw in here, maybe it's doesn't need to be said, but just in case, that I mean, that you and I both understand we're talking about two genius creative people, whatever we think of them personally. So we are using them as a window into the world of collaboration. Obviously they had a magic together that and personally that very few people ever are going to hit. So we have to, whatever we're saying, we know that it's just, they were incredible talents and they had incredible chemistry together. But could that have blown up in a couple of years? Yeah, it could have. They could have blown it up any time in there. So well, both of our points is that they brought something to the party, both of them, for that 10 years or 13 years, whatever it was, that they were together, that sustained them, and then it was gone. And and by the way, I don't think of that really as a tragedy, because I have appreciation for, and I think you do too, really, the singular vision of certain artists, and I think what John and Paul did was quite good by themselves, and I'm glad I have it, and those 10 years, it was, as they say, it's like from A to Z, and maybe it was a good time to bring it to a close. It's I know you're a big Stones fans, but is it that great that they've stayed together all this time?
Well, I think well, first of all, one thing I want to say is you have to be lucky to find somebody. They were very lucky. Like I've never, other than you, I've never found anybody. And this is, when I say you, I mean it endearingly, but this is the first project we've really done together. I mean, I've lived my career as a solo artist, as probably have you. So I've always wanted to find somebody I could create something with that would create mass appeal and revenue and make the world a better place. And I it's a struggle. So there's that. And then I'm going to answer your Stones point, but while I'm answering it, I want you to ponder this question. Is there another example of, not just in music, but let's stay with music, two sort of alpha males that split up and could, like Sting left the Police, but he was this Police. David Byrne left the Talking Heads, but he was the Talking Heads. So I don't know if there's Paul Simon left Art Garfunkel, but he was Simon and Garfunkel. Is there another example? Think about that for a second. The point about the Stones, just really quickly, I think the Stones Beatle comparison is apples and oranges, because the Beatles were, the Stones, I think, have been like 4 different bands. You know what I mean? The Stones that we know now, they're and I don't mean to belittle them, but they're a touring nostalgia act. And then there was the early Stones, which did all the great pop songs like Ruby Tuesday and whatever. And then there was the Jimmy Miller epic Rolling Stones, where he produced Sticky Fingers, Let It Bleed, Goat's Head Soup, and I'm forgetting Beggar's Banquet, and I think I'm forgetting another classic, which, you know, I don't know if I said Sticky Fingers. I think I did. Exile, yeah. So, and then there was the sort of Ron Wood, you know, kind of Rolling Stones. So to me, the Rolling Stones are the Rolling Stones Beatle comparison only works for me when the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were together.
Well, let me, as you were saying that, not that this is a revelation, but Keith and Mick, I think, were quite different from John and Paul. So you see, Keith and Mick kind of needed each other, you could say, because Keith's not a front man. You know, he can write, obviously, and he can sing a little bit, but not great. Jagger's obviously the singer, obviously the front man. So that kind of worked. Now, in John and Paul's case, see, I struggle with your question, because I'm not, there's got to be, just because of the history of music, but it's hard to think of another situation where you had 2 frontmen of that force and that quality of output, that is, and creativity. So they did, you know, that's what we keep saying, is like they didn't need each other in a way. They would have been okay apart, but you put them together. And, you know, by the way, I think it all, you know, again, not a revelation, but it all comes down to compromise. That these huge egos and huge talents were willing to tamper or minimize their ego to the point where they could let the other person shine. That's really huge.
Yeah. So to conclude this one, if we had to pick one, I'm going to go with 2 of us to title this episode, because to me, that sort of poetically and musically kind of encapsulates what we're talking about with these 2 guys. And it's sort of the musical, lyrical, and spiritual manifestation to me of collaboration is that song.
Well,
we don't have to decide this, but I'm just saying, as a point of closure to end this episode, I am good with that. I am good with that. We may have other episodes where I'm like, nah, it doesn't really, you know, but that's
I like Let Me Roll It. I think that's kind of a let me roll it to you, you know, and it's like, but let's bounce our ideas off of each other. I'll roll it to you, you roll it back to me, and we'll see where we end up.
And see, this is where our collaboration is an interesting one, because I can't sign up for that one for no other reason than we have a John and Paul song. So I would always lean into the John and Paul song as opposed to just the Paul song or just the John song. But here's what I do like about our collaboration. I never sort of saw the song that way, and I missed it. I missed it for all these years. I've missed it.
And by the way, where you see it as a jab at John, I think that song is a nod to John in the sense that it's kind of, it's got a riff that's sort of reminiscent of some of John's early 70s stuff, and the echo on the vocal, people have said, is quite like John. So
and the primal scream at the end.
Yeah,
he
yeah,
does that
yeah,
long.
exactly. Before we sign off, just one other thing I want to get in here is if you look at your collaborations in business, so you've done business projects, you could say, but I would say also artistic projects. I mean, I mean, there's commerce involved in it, but you've been involved in documentaries and you're telling stories in many ways. I've been in the game of creating seminars, trainings, that kind of thing. One thing I've noticed, I wanted to get your take on this, is that I like collaboration, like bouncing ideas, but then I find I'm usually the one in most collaborations where I take those sprinkles of ideas, but then I got to go and kind of be by myself and analytically sort of sift through it and expand upon it. And I can even remember that going back to high school of all things, where it's like, oh, should we get in a study group and prepare for the test? And I never found that greatly effective. I needed to sit down by myself to get it. What's been your experience of that?
I don't have a good answer for that question, even though I think it's a great question. I was thinking about the time that I spent in Moscow helping the Russians launch a sports television network, and how frustrating it was that they couldn't collaborate with each other. Metaphorically, they weren't speaking the same language. For me, I think because of the different natures of our careers, you are sort of more of an entrepreneur, and work within a sort of a system that's more your own. You're a solo artist, so to speak, in that way. I think that I've had to kind of assimilate and adapt to whatever the environment is that I've been thrown into. And in a way, that's a blessing. And in a way, I think I've really struggled with that and never really completely learned how to do that. Because I think that quiet, meditative insightfulness is a little bit more specific to anything I've done that relies less on other people. And I think that I used a tremendous amount of emotional energy trying to get everybody to kind of work in tandem. I think for me, the liberation of collaboration comes when I don't care what the other person thinks, as long as I feel I'm listening and respecting them. And I think for me, the struggle is always, is this person okay? Are they agreeing with me? Are they trying to fight with me? So it's a good question for me to explore, but I don't think that I've ever.
You don't have a set answer to it necessarily.
No, and I kind of wish I did. But I think.
But it's interesting that you make the distinction between whatever we want to call it, but sort of whether it's entrepreneurial or artistic, and then there's the corporate side of things where you in the, whether you're in the NFL network or the NHL network, which and ESPN, all these different corporations you've been involved in, you get your, I'm speculating or guessing, you get your teams together and maybe you're managing the team, but there's this corporate shell that's always in the background, and the politics of that, and playing the games of that, so to speak, that I don't know.
Yeah.
I would imagine that mostly gets in the way of the collaboration.
Yeah, it sucks. But it's also interesting because I wrote and performed a solo show a few years back in New York City, and somebody insisted that I have a director, and I didn't know this woman, and she was very strict, and I was at times frustrated because it was my material, but she was so strict and so strident and so sure. And when I finally let go and just said, I'm just going to do what she wants, that was a very liberating experience. Even there were times I didn't completely agree with her. So again, yes, you're right about the corporate thing. I think what I've been trying to figure out ever since I left the corporate world 10 years ago is what are the different kind of ways to collaborate with others when you don't have those sort of corporate Machiavellian overlords. And sometimes those collaborations are a dual project like this. Like I have a podcast with a friend of mine and we don't always agree. And then I've got like my radio show that I do each week, which is just my own baby. So yeah, I think for me, it always changes depending on the thing. And I think to just wrap this up with the whole John and Paul thing, like they're corporate overlords, and there's probably a much better way to say it than corporate overlords. Their inspiration, their North Star, their I think when it started, it was all about the music, man. And just like, like growing up and meeting girls and just, whatever. And then they were a slave to public opinion, their own egos, and the fact that they had become so intimately and so intricately entwined with each other that it just became extraordinarily difficult because the innocence was gone. And it goes back to what you said earlier. At the beginning, I think they knew what they wanted.
Well,
at the end, I don't think John knew what he wanted. Maybe Paul did. I don't think John did.
Well, I think he probably wasn't totally clear, but he wanted to, lean into the avant-garde scene with Yoko. But I think they you had two frontmen, and so there's this trajectory that started in 1957 of these two frontmen, parallel together, but then they get their romantic partners and their in a sense new artistic partners. And I just think it was unsustainable that those two frontmen could last much longer than they did. I mean, we'd all love that One More Beatle album.
No, I agree. And like I said, I think the learning of today is maybe I never realized before that and I'm sure we're missing something, but maybe we're not. There is no other example of that. I keep thinking about Paul Newman and Robert Redford, but they did two movies together and they weren't the writers of the movies. Yeah. So I think that's interesting. I also think, and I would make this last point, and maybe this is a conversation for another time. There are types of people, and I'm not saying you're Paul and I'm John, because that's too oversimplified, but there are types of people that I've known in my life that are restless and are constantly asking what is out there that I am not doing. And then there's other that are like, I like what I'm doing. How can I keep doing it, but challenge myself to do it in different ways? And I think those two guys were very different as that related. And Paul was forced to leave, and John, it doesn't matter who quit. Paul wanted to stay.
It was John.
John wanted to leave. Right.
John,
right. So I think that's interesting. What's our next episode?
So wait, are you a John?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious that if we were, like some people are dogs and some people are cats.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, if we had to choose, I think it's obvious that you would be a Paul and I would be a John. But I'd like to think there's grays, but
and we got a little bit of both in us. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So what's next time?
Oh God, I don't know. What do you want to do next? Friendship?
Sure. Sounds good, my friend.
All right.
Talk to you next time.
All right. See ya.